On the morning of December 27th, 1942, in the sky over the beachhead at Buna on the northern coast of New Guinea, a 22-year-old American second lieutenant named Richard Bong pushed his fighter over into a dive he had been taught never to attempt. Below him was a swarm of Japanese aircraft, the same kind that had ruled the Pacific sky for more than a year. Bong was not even supposed to be there. He belonged to another squadron entirely, one still waiting for its aircraft to arrive, and he was flying that day only because he had talked his way into someone else's fight. He came down through the enemy formation at a speed no Japanese fighter could match, fired, and pulled back up into the sky before they could turn on him. In the next few minutes, he shot down two of them, a nimble fighter and a dive bomber, the first two victories of what would become the highest-scoring career in the history of American combat aviation. He did not yet know any of that. What mattered that morning was both simpler and far larger. The aircraft he was flying had just done the one thing the enemy believed impossible. Within a little over 2 years, the Japanese air power that had swept from Pearl Harbor across half the world would lie broken over New Guinea, its finest pilots dead, and its mastery of the sky gone for good. The cause was an American machine and an American idea behind it, built for a single purpose. It was built to deny the enemy the only kind of fight he knew how to win. For 13 months, the Japanese had owned the air. Their naval fighter, the Mitsubishi that the Allies simply called the Zero, was the finest close-in dogfighter in the world. It could turn inside anything the Americans flew. It could climb like a startled bird, and it was flown by superbly trained veterans who had honed their skills over China and then carried them across the Pacific from Hawaii to the Dutch East Indies. In the opening months of the war, those pilots and their Zeros had seemed unstoppable. They had covered the strike on Pearl Harbor, wrecked American air power in the Philippines, humbled the British over Malaya, and ranged as far as the coast of Australia and the shores of Ceylon. Allied airmen came to speak of the Zero with something close to superstition, a fighter that could not be beaten in a fair fight, flown by men who never seemed to make a mistake. The reputation was not entirely earned, but in 1942, very few men on the Allied side knew how to prove that. American pilots had learned the price of fighting it on its own terms, and they had learned it in blood. In their Bell and Curtiss fighters, the P-39 and the P-40, they had gone into turning fights with the Zero and died in them. The lesson was written in the loss of friend after friend. Turn with a Zero and a Zero will settle onto your tail and kill you. There seemed to be no answer to it at all, only survival by luck and by weight of numbers. The result was a kind of moral defeat that ran deeper than any single battle. Allied pilots went up expecting to lose, and expecting to lose bred a caution that was itself a handicap. As long as the only way to fight was the Zero's way, no amount of courage could fix the problem, because courage flown into a turning fight against a better turning aircraft simply produced brave dead men. The thing that had to change was not the spirit of the pilots. It was the nature of the fight itself. A few men had already begun to work out how. In China, an American named Claire Chennault had trained his volunteer pilots never to dogfight the Japanese at all, but to dive on them from above, fire once, and dive away, trading agility for speed and height. It was the same idea the Lightning would later carry to its fullest. But Chennault's men flew P-40s, aircraft that could dive well enough, yet could not climb back to altitude quickly. So, they could strike once, and then had to run. What the Americans still lacked was a machine that could strike from above, and then climb straight back to its perch to strike again. The Navy had reached toward the same truth by a different road. Its pilots worked out a maneuver, a weaving pattern flown by a pair of fighters covering each other, that let even a slower American aircraft survive against the nimble Zero by never leaving a wingman alone and exposed. The lesson kept turning up in the same shape. The Zero could not be beaten by matching it turn for turn. It had to be beaten by teamwork, by tactics, and above all by a machine that fought on terms the Zero could not answer. The Lightning was going to be that machine. The Japanese pilots flying toward Buna that December morning had no reason to expect anything different. They had noticed a strange new twin-tailed aircraft over New Guinea in the past few weeks, and had not thought much about it. Some of them took it for a reconnaissance plane. The possibility that the Americans had built a fighter designed specifically to take the Zero's single greatest strength and turn it into a weakness had occurred to no one on their side of the war. But the fighter that broke the Zero was not born over New Guinea. It began years earlier on a drawing board in Burbank, California, where a young engineer out to build something that had never flown before. And it began in the hard lessons of pilots who had already learned at a bitter price the only way to beat the Zero. You do not fight it the way it wants to be fought. To understand what the Lightning did you have, to understand how completely the Zero had ruled. When Japan went to war at the end of 1941, its naval fighter was a genuine marvel of design. It was light, almost to the point of fragility, and that lightness brought it an agility no Allied fighter could match. It could turn inside a tighter circle climb at a steeper angle, and hang in the air at low speed in a way that let a skilled pilot slide onto an enemy's tail, and simply stay there until the kill was made. Against that, the doctrine the Americans had carried into the war was worse than useless. It told pilots to close with the enemy, and to maneuver, to fight the turning fight that airmen had fought since the First World War. Flown against the Zero, that doctrine was a recipe for death. The Japanese pilot would out-turn the American, slide in behind him, and finish it in seconds. The early Pacific was full of brave, well-trained American pilots who did everything their instruction told them to do, and were shot down for doing it. Then, in the summer of 1942, the Americans had an extraordinary piece of luck. In the Aleutian Islands, far to the north, a Zero made a forced landing and flipped over in soft ground. Its pilot killed, but the aircraft almost intact. It was recovered, shipped south, repaired, and flown by American test pilots. And for the first time, the enemy's wonder fighter gave up its secrets. The tests confirmed what a few pilots had already guessed. The Zero was deadly in a slow-turning fight and nearly helpless outside of one. Its controls grew stiff and heavy at high speed, so that above a certain velocity it could barely roll or maneuver at all. And it could not safely follow another aircraft into a fast dive. The way to kill it was now written down in hard numbers. Keep the speed high, keep the fight vertical, and never slow down to turn with it. The answer, when it finally came, did not try to beat the Zero at its own game. It changed the game completely. The aircraft was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, designed by a team under a young engineer named Clarence Johnson, a man the whole aviation industry would later know simply as Kelly. It looked like nothing else in the sky. A fighter with 2 engines and 2 long tail booms, and the pilot seated in a small central pod between them. The Lightning had been born from an Army requirement written back in 1937, a call for a high-altitude interceptor faster than anything then flying. To meet it, Kelly Johnson had done something radical, putting 2 engines in a fighter at a time when fighters carried 1, and splitting the airframe into twin booms to hold them and their turbo superchargers. The prototype had been fast enough to dash across the United States in a matter of hours in 1939, announcing that something genuinely new had arrived. Over the vast distances of the Pacific, the two engines meant something else besides speed. A pilot who lost one over hundreds of miles of ocean could still come home on the other, and a great many of them did exactly that. That strange shape carried a set of advantages the Zero could not answer. It had two powerful engines, each fed by a turbo supercharger that kept its full strength at heights where an ordinary engine gasped and lost half its power. It had a top speed near 414 far beyond anything the Zero could reach. It had a ceiling above 40,000 and in its nose, grouped tightly together, it carried one 20mm cannon and 4 heavy machine guns, all firing straight ahead in a single concentrated hammer of fire that did not depend on the enemy drifting into the exact point where wing-mounted guns crossed. That last point mattered more than it might seem. On most fighters, the guns were spread through the wings and had to be angled inward to meet at a single spot some distance ahead, so their fire was truly concentrated only at one range and scattered everywhere else. The Lightning's guns were packed into the nose, right in front of the pilot, and fired in a straight parallel stream that stayed lethal from close up to far beyond the reach of the Zero's lighter weapons. A P-38 pilot could open fire while still well outside the enemy's range. And with drop tanks slung beneath its wings, the Lightning could carry the fight for hundreds of miles, far beyond the reach of any single-engine fighter in the theater. There were other virtues the pilots came to love. The Lightning was solidly built and could soak up battle damage that would have downed a lighter aircraft. Its cockpit, set high in the central pod, gave a superb view all around. And in a fight, it could roll and dive and climb with a violence that let a disciplined pilot dictate every exchange. It was not a perfect aircraft, and it had its own quirks and dangers at the far edges of its performance. But in the hands of a trained pilot fighting the way he had been taught, it was very close to untouchable over New Guinea. The pilots gave it their trust, which is the highest thing airmen give a machine. Over hundreds of miles of jungle and shark-filled sea, two engines were worth more than any single-engine fighter's grace, because a Lightning that took a hit in one engine could still carry its pilot home. Men who flew it came to believe, with good reason, that they had the best fighter in the Pacific under them. And that belief was itself a kind of weapon. Confidence made them aggressive, and aggression flown with discipline made them deadly. But the machine was only half of the answer. The other half was a decision about how to fight, and that decision was the true heart of the whole thing. American pilots would stop trying to turn with the Zero. They would use the Lightning's speed and power to fight in the vertical instead of the horizontal. They would climb above the enemy, dive on him out of a height he could not reach, fire in one slashing pass, and use their momentum to zoom back up to altitude before he could react. Strike from above, then climb away. Never stay to turn. It was the reverse of everything a fighter pilot had ever been taught, and against the Zero it was murderous. The logic underneath was simple and unforgiving. A Zero could outturn a Lightning every single time, but it could not follow one down. Pushed into a high-speed dive, the light Japanese fighter shuddered and threatened to tear itself apart, while the heavier Lightning only gathered speed. A Zero could not climb after a Lightning that had traded its speed for height, and it could never catch a Lightning whose pilot simply chose to leave. The American, so long as he kept his discipline and refused the turning fight, held every card in the deck. He chose when to attack, and he chose when to break it off, and there was nothing the finest dogfighter in the world could do about it. Pilots came to think of it in terms of energy. Height was energy stored up, waiting to be spent. and speed was energy in motion, and the Lightning was a machine for turning one into the other and back again. A pilot who kept his energy high always held the choice of when to fight. A pilot who bled it away in turns, chasing a Zero around the sky, handed that choice to the enemy, and usually did not live to regret it. The hardest part was never the flying. It was the discipline, the constant refusal of the instinct to turn and chase, the patience to break off a promising attack and climb away, rather than be dragged down into the fight the Zero wanted. The very qualities that made the Zero supreme in a dogfight were the ones that doomed it against these new tactics. To be so nimble, it had been built impossibly light, which meant it carried almost no armor to shield its pilot, and no self-sealing tanks to survive a hit. A single good burst from the Lightning's concentrated guns could rip it open. Its own guns were light, and its airframe could not bear the stress of a fast dive. The Zero was a duelist's blade, elegant and lethal at close range, and all but useless against an enemy who would never close. There was a human cost hidden in that lightness as well. With no armor and no protection for its fuel, the Zero tended to burn when it was hit, and its pilot rarely got out. The same design choices that had made the fighter so agile turned it into a death trap once an enemy could reliably bring guns to bear, and the Lightning could. Each Japanese fighter a P-38 caught in a diving pass was likely not just an aircraft destroyed, but a trained pilot killed. And trained pilots were exactly what Japan could least afford to lose. The Japanese High Command made the danger worse by misreading it. Twin-engine aircraft in all of their experience were bombers or clumsy heavy fighters, too large for real air-to-air combat, so they filed the P-38 away as something other than a true fighter, and they built no answer to it, because they did not yet believe they needed one. By the time they finally understood over New Guinea that the Americans had put into the sky a fighter their Zero simply could not fight, the killing had already begun in earnest. There was a deeper wound beneath the tactical one. The superb Japanese pilots of 1941 had been the product of years of hard selective training, and there had never been very many of them. The battles of 1942 at the Coral Sea and Midway and over Guadalcanal had already killed a great many of the best, and Japan's training system could not turn out their equals fast enough to replace them. Every veteran lost to a diving Lightning was a man who could not truly be replaced, while the pilot who had killed him was one of thousands coming off American training fields. The Zero's weakness in the vertical fight was serious on its own. Combined with that slow bleeding away of irreplaceable skill, it was fatal. The man who brought the Lightning to New Guinea was General George Kenney, the commander of the 5th Air Force. Kenney had seen a young pilot named Richard Bong back in California throwing a P-38 around the sky over San Francisco with a wild natural skill that bordered on recklessness, and he had marked the young man and taken him along to the Pacific. Bong was a farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, the son of a Swedish immigrant, quiet and plain spoken on the ground, and completely without fear in the air. Bong's road to that cockpit had been an unlikely one. He had grown up on a farm in the far north of Wisconsin, one of 9 children, and he had learned to fly through a civilian training program while at Teachers College. He was a natural, gifted with an eye and a touch that could not be taught. And he was also, in the way of gifted young pilots, reckless, in training over California. He had looped his fighter around the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge and buzzed the streets of San Francisco. And he had been grounded and dressed down for it. The general who did the dressing down was George Kenney. Instead of ending the young man's career, Kenney remembered his flying, and when he shipped out to take over the 5th Air Force, he took the reckless farm boy with him. The war they flew into was going badly. Through 1942, the Japanese had pushed across New Guinea toward Port Moresby, the last real barrier between them and Australia. And Allied troops were fighting a brutal, disease-ridden campaign in the mountains and the swamps to throw them back. Air power was central to all of it, and for months the Japanese had held the upper hand overhead. Kenny had been sent to change that, and the Lightning was the instrument he meant to change it with. Bong had been assigned to one squadron, but flew that December with another, borrowing a cockpit while his own unit still waited for its Lightnings to arrive. The squadron he attached himself to was led by a cool, skilled Pennsylvanian named Thomas Lynch, one of the first true masters of the Lightning, and a man who would finish among the top aces of the theatre before he was killed. Under leaders like Lynch, the borrowed pilots and the new machines were learning the vertical game by flying it day after day against an enemy who did not yet grasp what was happening to him. The test came on the 27th of December 1942, over the New Guinea coast. About a dozen P-38s of the squadron Bong was flying with intercepted a large Japanese formation, and the fight unfolded exactly as the new doctrine had promised it would. Diving from above, the Americans tore through the enemy, and the Japanese could neither climb to reach them nor dive to follow them. The squadron claimed close to a dozen enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of a single Lightning. 2 of those kills were the first of Richard Bong's career. At the Japanese Naval Air Headquarters, the reaction was disbelief, hardening into a scramble to understand. Intelligence officers pulled apart everything they knew about the twin-tailed aircraft and found they had badly underestimated it. They had built their whole defense around the assumption that they would face the same American fighters they had always beaten, flown in the same old way. Now they had to reckon with a machine that fought in a dimension their Zero could not enter, and they had no quick answer to hand their pilots beyond a grim instruction. Do not fight the twin-tailed aircraft on equal terms. Engage it only with the advantage of height and numbers, and if the first pass fails, break off and run. The Japanese after-action reports read like confusion hardening into alarm. Pilots described an enemy that struck from impossible heights and impossible ranges, that could not be caught, and could not be pinned into a fight. The comfortable world of turning combat, the world in which they had never once met a serious equal, had simply ceased to exist over New Guinea. In its place was something they had no training for and no answer to. A vertical battlefield where speed and altitude decided everything, and the tight turn was worth almost nothing. The change came quickly once it had begun. Within a few weeks, Richard Bong was an ace, and he was only the most visible of a fast-growing number of them. New squadrons arrived in theatre, studied the combat reports of the men who had gone before, and drilled the same iron discipline into their pilots. Altitude is life, the training ran. Speed is life. Never turn with the enemy. Hold the height, dive, strike, and climb away, and do it again. Commanders drilled it relentlessly because the whole system depended on every pilot holding to it, even when his blood was up. A single man who forgot himself and turned to chase a Zero could die in seconds, and worse, could pull his wingman down with him. So, they trained it until it was instinct, until the urge to climb away from a beaten enemy overrode the urge to finish him with a turn. The pilots who learned that lesson lived and scored. The ones who could not learn it tended not to last long enough to matter. The scoreboard climbed all through 1943. Bong passed 10 victories, then 15, then 20, and other names climbed with him. Lynch among them, and a growing roster of aces who had mastered the diving attack. The Fifth Air Force was no longer just holding on over New Guinea. It was taking the sky away from the enemy, mission by mission, and pushing the Japanese back toward their great base at Rabaul. Every raid the Lightnings escorted got through more easily than the last, and every attempt the enemy made to contest them cost him pilots he could not replace. The proof at the strategic level came in the first days of March 1943, in the waters off New Guinea. A Japanese convoy was carrying troops to reinforce the desperate fighting around Lae, and Kenny's Fifth Air Force fell on it. The Lightnings flew top cover, and when the Zero escorts climbed to defend the ships, the P-38s met them in the vertical and held them off the bombers below. The bombers, running in low over the water, sank the convoy where it steamed. 8 transports and 4 destroyers went to the bottom in what became known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. And thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned before they ever reached the fighting. The resupply of New Guinea by sea effectively ended there. The Zero had failed to protect the one thing it most needed to protect. That is where the first half of this story ends, with the enemy's grip on the New Guinea sky beginning at last to come apart and never again to close. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the version that circulates online turns a whole air campaign into a single wonder weapon, and even gets the names of the aces wrong. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. 1 like. Nothing more. Thank you. By the middle of 1943, the Lightning was no longer an experiment. It had become the spearhead of American air power over New Guinea, and around it grew a whole generation of pilots who had learned to fight the new way from their very first mission. In August, the 5th Air Force stood up the 475th Fighter Group, the first unit built entirely around the P-38. And before the war was over, that single group would hold the 3 highest-scoring American aces in the Pacific. One of them arrived in that same month. First Lieutenant Thomas Maguire was aggressive, brilliant, and difficult, a New Jersey man who flew the vertical tactics with a ferocity that put him on the road to becoming the second highest-scoring American ace of the entire war. He was everything Bong was not in temperament. Talkative and sharp-edged where Bong was quiet. Hungry for the record where Bong seemed almost indifferent to it. He would later write down what he had learned into a set of combat notes that were passed around the whole theatre. A hard, practical guide to staying alive and killing in a Lightning. The two of them would spend the next year and a half locked in a strange, unspoken race. 2 young Americans climbing a scoreboard that the whole Pacific was watching, and that the newspapers back home followed like a sporting event. General Kenny had to manage the rivalry as carefully as any operation, pulling one man out of combat to protect a record and letting another fly on. But the Lightning's most important work was never really measured in personal scores. It was measured in reach. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the single most daring fighter mission of the whole war. A 500-mile ambush over open ocean to kill the man who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Do not go anywhere. In April of 1943, American codebreakers handed the war a rare and perishable gift. They had decrypted the travel schedule of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was about to fly an inspection tour of bases in the Solomon Islands, and for a few hours on the 18th of April, the exact time and place of his aircraft would be known to his enemies. The chance was almost too good to use. Some officers worried that shooting down Yamamoto would tell the Japanese their most secret codes had been broken, a secret worth more than any single admiral. In the end, the decision went the other way. up through the highest levels of the American command, and the order came down to attempt the interception. But there was a second problem, and it was one only a particular aircraft could solve. Distance. Yamamoto's route lay far beyond the reach of any ordinary fighter. More than 400 miles of open water out from the American field on Guadalcanal. Only one aircraft in the theater had the range, the speed, and the navigation to even attempt it. And that was the Lightning. The mission fell to a force of 16 P-38s drawn from several squadrons and led by a gifted navigator, Major John Mitchell. Mitchell planned the flight like a mathematical problem. He worked out a dogleg course of several separate legs that would swing wide around the islands and come up on the interception point from the seaward side, where no one would be watching for it. He calculated the headings and the speeds and the timings down to the minute for a 2-hour flight over open water, with no way to correct along the way. He had one chance to put 16 fighters at a single point in the sky at the exact moment a particular aircraft passed through it, hundreds of miles from home. It was the kind of navigation that bordered on prophecy. What they flew that morning was a feat of navigation as much as of combat. To slip under the enemy's radar, they went the entire way at wave-top height, only a few dozen feet above the sea, in total radio silence, holding their heading by dead reckoning across more than 2 hours of featureless ocean. There were no landmarks to check against, and no room for error. If Mitchell's timing or his course were off by even a little, the whole effort would come to nothing, and the Admiral would fly on untouched, while 16 fighters searched an empty sky. Mitchell's navigation proved very nearly perfect. At almost the exact minute he had predicted, the Japanese aircraft appeared ahead of them. 2 bombers carrying the Admiral and his staff, screened by 6 Zero escorts. While most of the American formation climbed to hold off the escorts, a small attack element bored straight in. Lieutenant Rex Barber pressed his fire into the lead bomber and sent it down, burning into the jungle. And the man who had planned the strike on Pearl Harbor died in the wreckage. A second bomber, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, was hammered down into the sea, though that officer survived. One Lightning did not come home. The exact credit for the Admiral's aircraft was argued over for decades afterward, but the modern verdict gives that kill to Barber. Then, the Lightnings turned for home. They had already been in the air for hours, and they still faced the long, low run back across the ocean to Guadalcanal, some of them nursing damaged aircraft and dwindling fuel. When they landed, and the count was made, the cost was 1 P-38 and its pilot, set against the life of the man who had conceived the attack on Pearl Harbor. By any measure a commander could name, it was among the most efficient single strikes of the entire war. The Japanese never learned while the war lasted that their codes had betrayed them. They put the loss down to bad luck and a chance encounter, and the secret that had guided 16 fighters to the right patch of empty sky held. It was a small masterpiece of intelligence and airmanship together, and only the Lightning's reach had made it possible even to attempt. The effect of it was as much moral as military. Yamamoto was the most admired officer in the Japanese Navy, and the Americans had reached out across hundreds of miles of empty ocean and plucked him out of the sky with a precision that seemed impossible to the men who suffered it. If the enemy could do that, then no one anywhere was truly safe. The myth of Japanese command of the Pacific, already cracked by Midway and by Guadalcanal, took another deep and public blow. And the aircraft that had made the whole thing possible was the very same twin-tailed fighter that was emptying the sky over New Guinea. For the Japanese pilots who had to face the Lightning day after day, the effect was corrosive in a way that went past mere losses. They had begun the war as the finest fighter pilots in the world, sure of their skill and their machine. Now they flew against an enemy they could not reach, could not catch, and could not escape. And death came at them out of heights they could not climb to. Captured letters and post-war accounts spoke of exhaustion and dread, of men who scanned the sun above them without rest, waiting for the twin-tailed shapes to fall out of it. The confidence that had carried them across the Pacific drained slowly away. Japan tried to build its way out of the problem. New fighters appeared over the last 2 years of the war. Faster machines meant to climb higher and dive harder, and finally meet the Lightning on its own ground. Some of them were genuinely dangerous aircraft, but they came in numbers far too small, flown too often by pilots too green to use them well, and they never arrived in time to change the outcome. The window in which Japan might have answered the P-38 had closed while its leaders were still arguing over whether it needed answering. Through all of it, Richard Bong simply kept scoring. His method almost never changed. He would climb above the enemy, choose his target, dive and fire from very close range. So close that on more than one occasion, he flew through the debris of the aircraft he had just destroyed. He always insisted that his own marksmanship was poor, and made up for it by getting near enough that he could not miss. It was a strange humility in a man doing something so lethal, and the pilots around him noticed it. He did not boast. He did not seem to hate the enemy. And he went about the deadliest work in the theatre with the manner of a man doing a job. That calm confidence spread through the American squadrons as the Zero's reputation collapsed. Where Allied pilots had once gone up expecting to lose, they now went up holding every advantage and knowing it. They picked the fights, they picked the moment, and they broke off when it suited them. The psychological ground had shifted all the way over. The men who had once been the hunted were now the hunters, and the enemy who had been the hunter now spent his missions watching the sky above him in fear. There was something about Bong in particular that caught people, and it was not swagger. He was, by every account, a modest and decent young man, uneasy with the fame that had landed on him, who wrote plain letters home, and seemed genuinely puzzled that his country had made him a hero. When they sent him on tours to sell war bonds, he hated it, and said he would sooner have a zero on his tail than face another crowd. He was the finest killer of enemy pilots the country produced, and he carried it more lightly and more uneasily than almost anyone around him. In April of 1944, he shot down his 26th and 27th aircraft and passed the old American record of 26 that Eddie Rickenbacker had set in the First World War. He went on flying even after that, sent home, celebrated, and sent back again. He was made a gunnery instructor with orders only to defend himself and not to go looking for combat, an order he chose to read very loosely. Over the Philippines in the last months of 1944, he kept adding to his total until it stood at 40 enemy aircraft, every last one of them shot down in a P-38, a number no American had ever reached, and none would ever pass. 40 victories is a figure that is hard to hold in the mind. It meant 40 separate times that Richard Bong had found an enemy aircraft, closed with it, and destroyed it, and 40 times that he had flown home when the man he fought did not. No American in any war before or since has matched it. And every one of those 40 had been won in the same machine, the twin-tailed Lightning, flying the same patient, disciplined vertical fight that the whole campaign had been built upon. Bong and Maguire never did settle their race the way the newspapers wanted them to. Both were dead within a year of each other. The one killed at home in a jet and the other in a jungle dogfight he should have refused. And the scoreboard simply stopped where it stopped. at 40, and at 38. What they had proven together mattered far more than which of them finished ahead. In December, on the airfield at Tacloban in the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur pinned the Medal of Honor to Bong's chest. Throwing away his prepared remarks, MacArthur called him, in a phrase that stuck to him for good, the man who had ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines. The citation honored not a single mission, but a stretch of weeks in which Bong, an instructor who was neither required nor expected to fight, had gone into combat again and again and shot down 8 more enemy aircraft. And then, with the record safely won, General Kenny pulled him out of the war for good. Bong went home in January of 1945, married his sweetheart Marjorie, the woman whose name he had painted on the nose of his Lightning, and took a new job as a test pilot for Lockheed. On the 6th of August 1945, the same morning that a single bomb destroyed Hiroshima half a world away, Richard Bong took off from the Lockheed field in California in one of the new P-80 jet fighters. The engine failed just after he left the ground. He tried to bail out, but he was too low for his parachute to open, and America's ace of aces was killed at the age of 24 in the kind of aircraft that was about to replace the one that had made him a legend. Thomas Maguire did not live to see the war's end, either. In January of 1945, over the Philippines, he broke his own hardest rule. Trying to help a wingman in a low-altitude turning fight, the exact kind of fight the Lightning was never meant to accept, he hung on to his heavy drop tanks too long, stalled at low speed, and spun into the ground. He died with 38 victories, second only to Bong, killed at last by the one thing he had always warned his own pilots never to do. The great Air Force base in his home state of New Jersey carries his name to this day. Maguire had earned the nation's highest award before he died. Over Luzon in the last days of 1944, across 2 days of savage fighting, he had shot down a string of enemy aircraft while shielding the bombers he was escorting, pressing his attacks through heavy fire, and for that, he received the Medal of Honor. More than almost anything, he had wanted to pass Bong's 40 and become the ace of aces himself. He died still chasing it, 4 victories short, brought down not by a better pilot, but by his own refusal to break off a fight he never should have entered. They were not the only ones. The commander of their group, Charles MacDonald, ran up a score that made him the 3rd highest-scoring American ace of the Pacific, and the 405th as a whole compiled a record that few fighter groups anywhere could rival. It had been formed barely more than a year before the war ended, equipped from the first with Lightnings, and manned by pilots schooled in the vertical fight. And in that short life, it became the deadliest American fighter group in the theater. The machine and the method put together simply worked. The Lightning's work in the Pacific went far beyond the famous names. Stripped of its guns and fitted with cameras, a reconnaissance version of the P-38 ranged over the whole theater, flying so high and so fast that it was nearly impossible to intercept, and it mapped the Japanese island bases so that others could hit them. In squadron after squadron, pilots the newspapers never mentioned flew the same disciplined vertical tactics and ground the enemy down. The aces were the visible edge of something much larger, a whole system of machines and men and methods that the Japanese could not match. By 1944, the 5th Air Force was not merely winning dogfights, but destroying the enemy's air power wholesale on the ground and in the air alike. In great raids on the Japanese base complex at Wewak, and later at Hollandia, American aircraft caught the enemy's planes and pilots and wrecked them by the hundred until whole stretches of the New Guinea coast were emptied of Japanese air power altogether. The Lightnings ranged out ahead and above, clearing the sky so the bombers could do their work, and the enemy who had once owned this coast could no longer even contest it. When the Americans returned to the Philippines at the end of 1944, the Lightnings went with them, and the pattern held. Over Leyte and Luzon, they seized the air within days of the landings. And Japanese attempts to reinforce the islands by air were met and slaughtered. The enemy still fought, and fought hard, and the fanatical suicide attacks of the war's last year took their own grim toll on American ships. But in the plain business of fighter against fighter, the contest had long since been settled. Air superiority was never an end in itself. It was the thing that made everything else possible. With the Lightnings holding the sky, the bombers could reach their targets. The transports could carry men and supplies. The ships could move by day, and the great leapfrogging advance across the Pacific could roll forward. Every mile the Allied forces gained on the long road back to the Philippines was gained under an umbrella of American air power. And over New Guinea that umbrella was, more than anything else, the P-38. Here is how it unfolded in order. December the 27th, 1942. The P-38 proves itself over New Guinea, and Richard Bong scores his first 2 victories. March 1943. Lightnings cover the destruction of a Japanese convoy in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. April 18th, 1943. 16 P-38s fly more than 400 miles to intercept and kill Admiral Yamamoto. April 1944. Bong passes Rickenbacker's old record with his 27th victory. December 1944. Bong receives the Medal of Honor and reaches 40 victories while McGuire closes on his own total. 1945, both aces die. One in a jet at home, one in a dogfight he should never have joined. The factors behind the reversal are worth naming plainly. The first factor was the machine. The P-38 gave American pilots speed, altitude, firepower, and range in a single airframe. And every one of those advantages was one the Zero could not match. The second factor was the doctrine. Vertical combat. The discipline of striking from above and refusing the turning fight was what let the machine's advantages actually be used. Without it, even a Lightning could be thrown away by a pilot who reverted to instinct and tried to turn. The third factor was reach. The Lightning's long range turned it from a mere fighter into a strategic weapon, one that could cover the sinking of a fleet in the Bismarck Sea, or fly 500 miles to kill an admiral over the Solomons. The fourth factor was the system standing behind it all. American industry could build Lightnings faster than they were lost, and American schools could turn out skilled pilots by the thousand, while Japan could replace neither its aircraft nor its veteran airmen. Attrition did the rest, and attrition never sleeps. The numbers behind that attrition were merciless. American factories built the P-38 in the thousands, close to 10,000 of them before the lines finally shut down, and replaced every combat loss and then some. American schools turned out fresh pilots with hundreds of hours in the air before they ever saw a shot fired in anger. Japan could do neither. Its aircraft production could not keep the pace, and its pilot training, once the most demanding in the world, was cut shorter and shorter, until it was feeding half-trained boys into a fight against seasoned men in superior machines. The outcome of that arithmetic was never really in doubt. Strip away the maps and the casualty counts, and the fall of the Zero comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. The enemy owned a sky of tight turns and close dogfights, and the Americans simply refused to fight in it. They built a machine and a method that lifted the whole battle into the vertical, into altitude and speed, and the diving pass. And up there, the Zero's genius for the turn was worth nothing at all. And there is an honest footnote that the loudest version of this story likes to leave out. The Lightning did not win the Pacific Air War by itself. Out over the ocean and the island fleets, the Navy and Marine fighters, the Corsair and the Hellcat, actually shot down more Japanese aircraft than the P-38 ever did. What the Lightning did, better than any other aircraft in the war, was rule the land-based air war over New Guinea and give America the two greatest aces it ever produced. The whole truth is more crowded than the legend, and it is still a triumph.